Atari does not go gentle into that good night, at least not yet. It's NES Works Gaiden episode 23. While the NES dominated the American console market in 1988 in ways it hadn't been seen basically since Atari 2600 was the only option in 1979, Nintendo wasn't the only company out there. We'll get to Sega's offerings for 88 soon enough in Gaiden, but for now let's not forget that Atari was still out there. Barely. And by many, I mean that while the NES saw some of its all-time classics debut in the first half of 1988, including Double Dragon and Metal Gear, the Atari 7800 had one game, that's it. A conversion of Lucasfilm Games' breakout hit, a virtual sports game called Ballblazer. When other platforms of the era hosted epoch-defining creations like Contra, Phantasy Star, and Maniac Mansion, it's difficult to look at a first-half 1988 lineup consisting entirely of a port of a 1984 computer game and think, oh yes, this is a system that's destined to stick around. But at least it played host to one hell of a port of that game. Ballblazer had previously appeared on Atari's older consoles by the time it shipped for 7800 in the spring of 1988. Obviously, 5200 versions quite compared to this adaptation in terms of speed or visual detail, though given that Lucasfilm originally created the game for Atari 8-bit home computers, the 5200 release, which shared a common architecture with those computers, fared respectably well. The magic of Ballblazer was in how its programming allowed it to give players a blazing fast, first-person action experience on even the most meager 8-bit hardware. Programmer David Levine kept the gameplay simple. It's essentially one-on-one field hockey, and he used a minimalist geometric graphic style to make possible the illusion of dashing around across a checkerboard field. Along with the first-person flight simulator Rescue on Fractalis, Ballblazer helped put the Lucasfilm Games name on the map. I mean, the fact that the company sported the name of a George Lucas fresh from conquering the planet with Return of the Jedi is actually what put the company on the map in the first place, but Ballblazer made clear the fact that the fledgling game studio wasn't some fly-by-night vanity label. Based on interviews with former Lucasfilm Games staff, my understanding is that the company came into existence thanks to a cash infusion from Atari, who presumably saw Lucas's pioneering work in computer graphics through Industrial Light and Magic and figured that would somehow translate into cool video games. Logistically speaking, of course, this was nonsense, but Lucas owned the hottest film properties in the world at the time, and his aura of geek cred attracted the most talented computer nerds to Marin County. Lucasfilm Games began as a scrappy little skunkworks tucked into a corner of a building of the Skywalker Ranch, but from those offices issued forth a string of some of the most innovative and influential games of the 1980s and early 90s. A parade of hits began here with Ballblazer, a game that sold remarkably well considering the American home gaming market was in the throes of a massive contraction, and pirated copies of the game leaked into the wild long before the retail release. The critical and commercial success of Ballblazer on Atari home computers and consoles made Lucasfilm's gaming division viable right from the start, and funded the creation of further games. Most notably, the company's beloved Scum adventure games. There is a certain irony in the fact that 7800's meager offering of Ballblazer for spring 1988 put the platform in direct competition against platforms offering the amazing Maniac Mansion, which Ballblazer begat. For the dozen or so Americans actively importing Japanese games in the 1980s, Ballblazer for 7800 also had to square off against the Japan-only Famicom conversion of the game, courtesy of Pony Canyon. Would you be surprised to learn that the 7800 absolutely demolishes the Famicom port? Well, you shouldn't. The NES's tile-based graphical format wasn't really suited for the visuals seen in Ballblazer. There's also the fact that Pony Canyon tended not to have, shall we say, absolute mastery of the hardware. On the other hand, Ballblazer for 7800 comes to us courtesy of General Computer Corp., the very same company responsible for the console's innards in the first place. It's hardly a fair comparison. In fact, Ballblazer is the first of two 7800 games to make use of a trick that was becoming increasingly popular on NES in 1988, the inclusion of an add-on enhancement chip. Unlike the NES's memory mappers, however, Ballblazer's built-in booster didn't enable more storage or additional sprites. Instead, GCC grafted a Pokey chip into the cartridge, making use of a rarely utilized console feature. Atari's Pokey chip had powered the sound effects of the company's golden era arcade hardware, and GCC had created the 7800 with the idea that the hardware could handle Pokey access through the cartridge slot. No doubt the system would have fared better in general with Pokey built into the console, but I imagine that cost considerations prevented that, especially given that the actual age of the 7800's design dates back to the early 80s, when the Pokey would have been far more expensive relative to the cost of other console components. In any case, Ballblazer contains a Pokey chip, enabling it to take advantage of one of the game's defining features. Fittingly, for a company that spun into existence from the house that made Star Wars, a film elevated from schlock to masterpiece by its John Williams score. Lucasfilm Games developed a reputation for innovating with video game music. While the dynamic iMuse system that would debut with 1991's Monkey Island 2 sees the lion's share of Lucas Gaming's audio praise, the so-called riffology heard throughout Ballblazer was no less inventive or important. Conceived and programmed by Peter Langston, riffology was in essence a technique to create procedurally generated soundtracks. Unlike the industrial dissonance that Yuzo Koshiro and Motohiro Kawashima explored with the randomized computer-generated tones of the Streets of Rage 3 soundtrack, Langston's approach was essentially built on the principles of live improvisational jazz. The Ballblazer theme employs algorithmic processes to create variants of a fixed composition. The title theme's instrumentation, percussion, bass, and melody lines all adheres to a predefined hook, but each voice can riff on the composition. These elements combine in nearly infinite iterations, yet the central theme nevertheless comes through unmistakably, like a great live band jamming around its hits. Think the Grateful Dead, but with far more energy and much less acid. Also, no one's ever released a 3-hour CD of bootleg Ballblazer tunes, thankfully. So what is Ballblazer? Again, it's essentially one-on-one field hockey, an abstracted, futuristic interpretation of a real-world sport. Each player in Ballblazer controls a robotic avatar that glides, friction-free, across a checkerboard field, vying for possession of a ball. Your objective once you acquire the ball is to launch it into your goalposts, while your opponent runs interference in an attempt to do the same. Ballblazer's design can be slightly disorienting at first, as the camera system is designed to make high-speed, free-moving first-person action realistic on one-button controllers. It achieves this by constantly auto-centering on one of 2 points, the goal and the other player. When you have possession of the ball, the camera fixes on your goal, or at least the goal side, since the goal itself constantly slides back and forth across the edge of the field. Once you lose the ball, however, your opponent becomes the focus. This means you need to watch for the ball in your peripheral vision, as it were, when no one has possession of it. But when the other player snatches up the ball, the camera allows you to home in on them and attempt to snag the ball away. Pressing the action button allows you to potentially strip the ball away from an opponent, though the button also launches your goal attempts, which means there's no percentage in hammering the button while you're attempting to recover it. Smashing the button indiscriminately means you'll be able to pull the ball away easily enough, but you'll immediately throw it away in an almost guaranteed failed shot at landing points. The constant whiplash of the camera takes some getting used to. It allows the action to maintain a breakneck pace though, so it is worth the effort. The scoring system uses an unusual back and forth style in which both players start with the same number of points and attempt to gain a majority percentage and hold on to those points until time ends. The system would be imitated by a few other sports games, including Penguin Wars by UPL, as seen on Game Boy Works long ago. To keep things interesting, the losing player has one major advantage, a much larger set of goals to aim toward. The greater your point advantage over your rival, the smaller your goal space becomes. By the point at which you need to earn a single point to take the match before time runs out, your goal is barely larger than the ball itself. Combined with the constant motion of the target, a rare instance of the phrase moving the goalposts being literal rather than figurative, nailing that last point takes a remarkable degree of skill, or perhaps luck. A match between 2 equally experienced players can be a white-knuckled contest packed with constant ups and downs. Of course, you can also play against the computer, which offers 9 different skill levels. The lowest difficult level is so inept that you might not be able to lose against it even if you tried. On the other hand, the AI for the maximum difficulty level plays with such ferocity and precision that it's hard to imagine anyone being able to defeat it, period. You can also set the computer to play against itself, pitting any skill level against any other. Cranking up a match to 2 max difficulty computer players is a great way for an observer to experience an amazing sensation known as motion sickness. All in all, Ballblazer proudly stands as one of the absolute highlights of the Atari 7800 hardware. The game may have been a bit seasoned by 1988, but this was easily the best adaptation of the Lucasfilm classic to have appeared on consoles, and it stands up well to contemporary computer versions as well. If nothing else, its use of the Pokey add-on really makes you wonder what the 7800 could have accomplished with longer life and more adventurous developer support. Alas, as we'll see, truly original games didn't begin to make their way to 7800 until it was far too late for the platform to catch up with the competition. Sadly, the next release for 7800 a few months later was the kind of game that was more typical for the system during those crucial early days for NES, as Nintendo was winning American hearts and minds, much to the horror of Goonie xenophobes like Stossel. Epyx's Winter Games showed up on just about every platform under the sun back in those days, and the 7800 was no exception. And this version was only barely less lackluster than the one that had appeared the year before on NES. Really, Winter Games was one of those big hits you just had to be there for. And by there I mean playing Commodore 64 games in 1984. At the time of its debut, Winter Games and its counterpart Summer Games gave players an unprecedented amount of athletic variety in a video game. At the same time, it combined an authentic view of Olympic events with stunning animation. Compared to similar contemporary releases from Konami, namely the Track and Field series, Epyx's games demanded more nuanced interaction than mere button hammering, while also treating its virtual athletes like actual humans, as opposed to little cartoon people. I don't know that one or the other approach was correct, and the two franchises simply allowed players to enjoy their simulated sports in their preferred flavor. Unfortunately, Atari 7800 in 1988 is not C64 in 1984. Still, this version of Winter Games does have a few things going for it, despite being displaced in time. For starters, 7800 fans didn't have a whole lot of sports options to pick from at the time of this game's release. Before this, there was one-on-one. Secondly, although this port only has 4 of the original PC version's 7 events, just as with the NES game, these 4 events make for a more interesting mix than on NES. It does share 3 of these events in common with the NES adaptation, but they're all presented more respectably here than the work that Atelier Double did on NES, even if the incredible slightness of the events remains unchanged. You have the ski jump, in which you hurtle down a ramp before launching into the air in an attempt to perform wacky aerial stunts while still landing gracefully and earning as much distance as possible. The bobsled event sees you streaking down a tube while attempting to lean into corners in order to maintain your speed without wiping out. The speed skating event pits you against another racer as you attempt to work up and maintain your velocity. Rather than playing as a track and field style button masher, speed skating instead requires a more delicate touch as you use the controller to work your legs in time and find an optimal rhythm to keep your racer going. Mastering speed skating can be a huge help in sorting out the 4th event, which replaces the awful figure skating contest seen on NES. Here, the biathlon event changes things up by moving speed skating from a flat rink to a ski slope and throwing target shooting into the mixture. The rhythmic motion that proves so essential for speed skating also becomes a necessity here as your overland skier tromps through the snow across flat and uphill scenes. Occasionally you'll come across a downhill slope and can ski freely to build up velocity that carries onto flat spaces and uphill portions of the track, but for the most part you get about by tapping the controller in a steady rhythm. The traversal scenes are broken up by a handful of scenes in which you switch to a target shooting perspective and attempt to line up shots on a distant target and fire off 4 rounds in rapid succession. This target shooting works a little differently from the usual video game gun approach, as you have no control over your targeting reticle. Instead, you simply need to time your shot as the reticle scrolls endlessly over each successive target. This isn't too tough if you take your time, but obviously, this being a timed contest, you want to take each shot as quickly as possible. The need to pull the trigger as efficiently as you can manage makes it easy to let your nerves get the best of you and miss a shot or 4 in your attempt to keep your overall time low. All told, you can see all there is to do in Winter Games in the space of about 5 minutes, and 4 of those minutes are the biathlon. There's not much to this game, especially if you're playing solo, though I could see it providing some moderate competitive amusement for 2 or more players. Both Winter Games and Ballblazer for 7800 stand up well against their contemporary ports to NES and Famicom. It's still difficult to say these conversions feel like much of a victory for Atari, though. If conversions of 4-year-old computer games were the metric by which kids were judging console games in 1988, sure, the NES and Master System would have been in deep trouble. The reality is that the Nintendo ports, inadequate as they may have been, were mere footnotes for those consoles, whereas they're the main event here. Next time NES Works Gaiden dives into the 7800 library, we'll see another one of those musty old computer games that were so common. But at the same time, we'll also see the first original creation for the system.